screen would be great. Awesome. So good morning, everyone. My name is Ben McCartney. My co-author on this paper, Calvin Zhang, is in the chat and in the Slack. Before we get started, Tony, I want to thank you and all the organizers for putting this together. The past few weeks for me have been very discombobulating and upsetting, as I'm sure they have for a lot of you. So having something to work on and look forward to has been very helpful. So looking forward to the comments on the paper, obviously, but also just for my own mental and emotional health, this conference has been super helpful. So what I'll present today is this work with Calvin about residential sorting. It's about where people choose to live and how they choose where to live. Specifically, we're going to talk about sort selling and sorting across political affiliation, across political party lines. I'll also be referring to this concept as political segregation. The key finding of the paper is that homeowners are more likely to sell their homes and less likely to refinance their mortgages as the share of opposite party neighbors increases. In other words, Democrats prefer not to live near Republicans and Republicans prefer not to live near Democrats. So that key finding motivates our title, Sort Selling. It's not a typo, it's just a bad pun. You're all muted, but I see some smiles, so I assume you're all chuckling to yourselves. That's good. This research was conducted at the Philly Fed, so the normal disclaimer applies. This paper represents preliminary research that's being circulated for discussion purposes. The views expressed are solely those of me and Calvin and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. And the work is super preliminary. This is the first time it's been presented to a formal audience, so we're very much looking forward to your feedback. I'll start today with a motivational figure. It's one I'm sure that we've all seen before and are familiar with. And what it shows is the striking political segregation, especially between urban and rural areas. So these are precinct election results from the 2016 election. And this sort of political segregation has been well documented at this high level. And it's also been increasing over time. To create this figure, what we've done is zoom in on North Carolina. North Carolina has 3,000 of these precincts, each with an average of about 2,000 registered voters. So what we've done is we've calculated the difference in vote share between the winning party and the runner-up party, and then plotted the share of precincts in each election that were blowout, where the winning party won by more than 50% of the vote. So the key takeaway is that these like super politically segregated precincts have increased in importance over time. Blue precincts are becoming even bluer, red precincts are becoming even redder, and there's more of these precincts over the last 20 years. All right, before we get into the weeds, I'll summarize the key contributions of the paper. So if there's one slide that illustrates the paper, it's this one. So the first contribution we make in this paper is to zoom down past the county level and past the precinct level all the way to the household level. It's well known, that we have this urban and rural polarization, but what's less obvious is whether that political sorting is also occurring at a more micro level. So our first research question is, do birds of a political feather flock together even at this hyper-local level? And the answer is yes. So what this figure does, it's basically the same as before. We created this one though, zooming all the way down to census blocks. This is downtown Raleigh. To be clear, what I'm calculating here is the share of households in a census block that are registered as Democrats divided by the share that are registered as either Democrats or Republicans. We'll think more carefully about unaffiliated voters later on in the talk. And then the bluer the census block, the higher the share of Democrats. And what we see is that even within downtown Raleigh, there's evidence of people sorting into these neighborhood silos by political affiliation. So compared to the previous slide, which uses vote outcomes, this uses voter registration records. So in North Carolina, when people register to vote, they have the option of registering to vote with a party, with the Democratic or Republican Party. And that's observable to us. We can see that. So then we can use that at the individual household level to create this share. Also, by going all the way down to the household level, we contribute not only the fact that the sorting is occurring at that level, but also we can speak to mechanisms for why that sorting is happening in a way that previous work can't. So we might observe this sort of political segregation for two Boo-style reasons. If households affiliated with the same party, have similar preferences for things like schooling or pollution, public infrastructure. That could explain this. On the other hand, households might also sort if they have preferences for the characteristics of their neighbors specifically. And we call that kind of sorting homophilic sorting. That is, for example, a household might want to live next door to a household of the same race or of the same religion precisely because they share that race or religion. And if we observe political sorting just at the higher up level, we can't disentangle whether Tibu sorting is causing this sort of shift or whether it's homophily. So what we do, since we have this hyperlocal data, is we conduct this experiment where we compare households in the same census block group who each got new next door neighbors. So they literally got a new next door neighbor move in next door. We say that a household is treated in this setting if the new next door neighbor is affiliated with the opposite political party. So a Republican moving next door to a Democrat or a Democrat moving next door to a Republican. And then we compare those households to other homes in the same census block group who also got a new next door neighbor, but whose new next door neighbor was not affiliated with the opposite political party. And then we follow them over time and ask who's more likely to have moved out. And what we find is that those treated households, households with new next door neighbors of the opposite political party, are significantly more likely to have moved away than comparable households in the same census block group who also got new next door neighbors, but whose new next door neighbors were not affiliated with the opposite political party. And what this test helps us do is disentangle these two stories. In a world where all of this sorting is driven by Tibu-style mechanisms, then you wouldn't expect that who gets the new next door neighbor of the opposite political party is going to be especially more likely to move. If an area is gentrifying and some people don't like that the school system is changing or that there's a bunch of new Ethiopian restaurants opening up, you'd expect both of them to be equally likely to move away, not just the household who got the new next door neighbor of the opposite political party. So in short, Tibu-style sorting stories can't explain all of this. So households have a preference, at least some households have some sort of a preference for co-partisan next door neighbors, and that's driving some of this sorting that we see in the data. So the paper asks two things. The first is what drives households' moving decisions, and the second is what role do personal politics and political polarization play in that decision. We're focusing on political affiliation for two reasons. The first is an increased importance of party identification for people's social identity. There's lots of evidence that members of one political party increasingly affiliate themselves and consider their political party affiliation a salient self-identifier. And not only that, but they increasingly loathe members of the opposite political party. So in a recent paper, Calmo and Mason ask, using a survey instrument, do you ever think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of opposing party in the public today just died? And to this question, 15% of Americans responded yes. However, whether this vitriol that people feel or claim they feel towards members of the opposing party has real economic consequences or whether it's just so-called political cheerleading is still being debated. So that is super easy to be hyper-partisan on Facebook where there's nothing really at stake, and we absolutely see that. But when push actually comes to shove, it's still an open question, I think, if people's real economic decisions are being affected. And that leads to the final contribution this paper makes, which is strong evidence that there are real economic effects of political polarization. We find that households move, perhaps one of a household's biggest decisions, and that decision is affected by the political affiliations of their neighborhoods and their next door neighbors. So at this point in the presentation, I want to clarify what I mean when I say political sorting. To be clear, it's not necessarily the same thing as political polarization. So this paper is documenting this effect, this political sorting, and what I mean by political sorting is blue areas becoming bluer, red areas becoming redder, and people sorting themselves into these very small neighborhood silos. Political polarization is the underlying mechanism. It's what we think is the cause of this effect. So political polarization doesn't have a nailed down definition yet, and it depends a lot on the context and who's talking about it. But it generally refers to increases in the correlation between policy views and partisan identity, a decline in the importance of political moderates, or increased animosity between the two parties. So what this paper does is document parcel level sorting that is occurring through and because of political polarization. So that is hyper-local neighborhoods are becoming especially blue or red because people don't like living next door to members of the opposite political party. All right, so before we get into the empirical work, allow me one more clarification. A frequently asked question about this project, and one I think we're going to talk about in the discussion, at least I predict we will. The question is, do households prefer co-partisans for their party affiliations specifically, or for other personal characteristics and preferences that are often correlated with that political party? So to be clear, that's an important limitation of this paper. We can't disentangle those two things. We don't have enough data on all people's other choices to be able to split these apart. That being said, there's a lot of evidence, along with a sort of political polarization idea, that preferences are increasingly clustered within party. So the implication for us then is that if we see a Democratic household moving away from a Republican household, we don't necessarily have to disentangle if they're moving away from a Republican or if they're moving away from someone from a household that watches Fox News and owns a lot of guns. We don't necessarily have to split those apart to still take something away from our results. Now, to be sure, there are exceptions to every item on this list. And much like Asaf, I kind of like threw in a COVID-19 relevant bullet to the slide. But how these exceptions affect our interpretation of the results, I think we'll talk about after the presentation. But at least for now, this is the way Calvin and I are thinking about our answer to this question. All right, so I'll wrap up the introduction with these empirical predictions. If we live in a world where households have a preference for living near co-partisans and are willing to pay some economic cost to realize that preference, then these are the things we'd expect to see. The first two have to do with moving and migration, which is what this paper is really about. If households prefer to live near co-partisans, then as the share of opposite party neighbors increases, we'd expect to see them more likely to move away. Not all households can realize that preference right away, but might be planning on moving. But not yet able to. And then what we'd expect to see is, since refinancing is costly, they would be less likely to refinance. These three predictions are important heterogeneity tests for pinning down the precise mechanism. So we'll look at what happens to our effects across measures of voter apathy over time and across population density. And then we'll finish today by exploring where households move to. So answering these super micro level questions requires incredibly rich data. You can't answer these types of questions, and especially can't tease apart the Tibu sorting from the homophily using just state or county measures of political affiliation or migration. You need something more micro than that, and Calvin and I have put together this data set that combines data from two sources. So the first data source I think a lot of us are familiar with is the CoreLogic Solutions real estate data. The data set combines deeds data from county records offices and tax assessors offices. So for every property in North Carolina, or about 87% of the populations of counties of North Carolina, we know the exact name and owner, or name of the owner of each property and its precise site address, any transactions, purchases, or refinances that have taken place at the house, and then some characteristics of the properties. So what CoreLogic does is it goes to all of these county registers and assessors offices and cleans all the data and collates it and makes it available. So I went to the Durham County raw data myself and looked up 4100 Livingston Drive. This was not a random address. This is where I lived for many years. So we can see me living here, paying my taxes. We could also go find me in the deeds data and see that I bought the house in 2013 and who I bought it from, and then that I sold it in 2018 and who I sold it to. So that's the first half of the data. The second data source we use is the North Carolina voter registration data. So this data is completely publicly available. Nothing we're using is confidential. Nothing we're using you have to pay for. Nothing we're using you have to apply for. You guys can all right now go to this link and download all of this data if you're so interested. North Carolina also has a voter lookup functionality built into the website. So many states have this. You can go look up yourself if you're registered to vote, and they ask for some personal information, like your birth date is something they tend to ask for, and you can see if you're registered. North Carolina doesn't have that. You can just put in any name that you want. So I know you're all on your computers, so if you want to go look up any Duke or UNC faculty and see if they're registered to vote, you can absolutely go do that. And you can look up also anyone who has ever been registered to vote, going back to 2005 in North Carolina. So I've looked up that same person from the previous slide. We can see that I registered to vote, that I'm registered with the Democratic Party, some demographic characteristics about myself. And then in this right panel here, we can see all of the elections that I voted in while I was registered to vote in North Carolina. I'm now inactive. So what we do to build our data set is merge these two. And it's actually a relatively easy merge because they both have complete name and precise address. So as data merges go, this one was relatively easy to do. So then we have a final data set that lists all the properties in North Carolina, who owns them, and the political affiliations of their owners, and then the sale and mortgage decisions that they made while owning the property. There's a full summary statistics table in the paper if you're interested, but here we summarize a few key stats. We have 52 million single family, so that's a sample selection to keep the sample something we can understand. 52 million single family homeowner by quarter observations. 0.51% sell in a quarter, about 2% refinance in a quarter, and 0.75% get a new next door neighbor on either side in a quarter. From the voter data, we know that 37% of households are Democrats, 34% Republican, 16% unaffiliated, and 13% multi-party. We're defining political affiliation at the household level. So these multi-party households are homes where there are two people on the deed who are not affiliated with the same political party. We also have demographic data from the voter rolls. So we know that 79% of households are white and 16% are Black. And finally, we use the voter history, the elections that people have participated in to classify households as intense or apathetic. Intense households are households that vote in all the local and special elections, where apathetic households are households that are registered to vote but have either never voted or vote just in presidential elections in November. All right, so now we'll look at our first result. Opposite share is defined as the share of other households on the block affiliated with the opposite political party as a given household. So it's an interaction effect between party affiliation, which is the household's own affiliation, and party block share, which is the share of other households on the block, so not including myself, affiliated with each party. And then opposite share lights up as Republican shares for Democratic households and Democratic shares for Republican households. So you can think of this effect as sort of the average of those two effects. So an increase in opposite share reflected here averages the increase in Democratic share on a Republican household's likelihood of selling next quarter, and the increase in a Republican's likelihood of selling next quarter as Democratic share increases. We include a number of control variables that you can get from the previous two slides, and then increasingly restrictive fixed effects. And what we find, the way to interpret this 0.104 here, is that a 20 percentage point increase in the opposite party share increases the probability of selling next quarter by 0.0208 percentage points, or 4% for the average Democratic or Republican household in North Carolina. So a limitation of this test is that it's not particularly well identified. I think it demonstrates more rigorously that political sorting is occurring within members of one group, with members of one group being more likely to move away, but it doesn't really pin down that there's a causal relationship, and definitely doesn't speak to the mechanisms at all. So what we do next is that new next door neighbor study that I talked about at the top of the presentation. So recall the sample is now much smaller. This is just the sample of households that got a new next door neighbor in a given quarter. And then we're looking at what happens to whether or not they have moved away in the next 2 years. So this is now just a cross-sectional regression. And what we find is that getting a new neighbor of the opposite political party increases the probability of a given household selling within 2 years by 0.289 percentage points, or 5.6%, compared to other households who also got new next door neighbors but who didn't move. And this, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, helps pin down the political polarization is causing migration. That is, you could get this sort of result and get nothing here. If areas were gentrifying and all Republicans were leaving an area, or all Democrats were leaving an area at a similar rate. So the fact that new opposite neighbor matters even within block group by quarter suggests that there's some sort of political polarization. People not liking people of the opposite political party is literally pushing them apart. All right, so those are the two main results of this paper. That's the key thing that I want you to take away. And for the rest of the talk, we'll look at some secondary results. This first one is very, very new. Haven't really talked about this with anyone yet. So it's just me and Calvin sort of thinking about this. So we're super excited, especially to get feedback on this slide and how to think about tipping points. So in the previous tables, what we showed is that higher opposite party share, or getting a neighbor of the opposite political party, induces more selling. But there's no reason to believe that that effect has to be linear. So it could be that as the opposite block share increases from 20 to 25%, that has a different effect than when it increases from 50 to 55%. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. So we've also split that effect we estimated in opposite block share into its two component parts. So this is Democratic share increasing on Republicans, and this is Republican opposite block share, or Republican block share increasing on Democrats. And what we see in both cases is that as the opposite block share increases, households are more likely to move away. So as a very Republican area starts to get Democrats moving in, Republicans are more likely to move away. But after some point, that result goes away. So how exactly to interpret this is still something we're thinking about, and we're looking for your feedback there. So hopefully you're all writing down smart and helpful things in the Slack. That would be great. Next, we'll look at the refinance results. So going back to the empirical prediction, what are we thinking? We're thinking that households not liking people of the opposite party is pushing them to move away from their neighborhoods. Not all people can realize that preference. They might know that they want to leave at some point. So if they know they want to leave in the next few years, that would make them less likely to refinance, since refinance is costly. That's the story we have in our heads. So what we do is repeat all of the same tests, the opposite party share and the next door neighbor, and find that increases in opposite party share decrease the probability that a household refinances, and that getting a new neighbor of the opposite party decreases the probability of refinancing as well. This next test here is, I think, our most important heterogeneity test. What we do now is conduct those same tests as before, but use that voter history data to split households up. So intense households are the households that have voted in lots of special and local elections, and apathetic households are households registered to vote, but who vote very rarely. And what we find with the intense cell next quarter is the same result for an intense household. So someone who is more likely to be partisan, or at least politically motivated and involved, increases in opposite party share make that household more likely to move away. But now think about our story where the selling decision is being driven by political polarization. If that's the case, then for those voters who are apathetic and for whom political affiliation might be less important for their self-identity, what would we expect to see? We'd expect to see no effect, that increases in opposite party share wouldn't change their selling decisions. And that's what we find. We then do the same thing for the refinance tests. And in this case, both groups are less likely to refinance as the share of opposite party neighbors increases, but it's especially true for intense voters. We also repeated the next door neighbor tests using these measures. Those tests become incredibly demanding of the data because the sample is already limited just to people who got new next door neighbors in a given period. You can see all the results in the paper. They're much less statistically significant. The one that lights up the most, though, is that if your new next door neighbor is of the opposite political party, their intensity makes me more likely to move. Whether I am intense or apathetic matters less than whether my new next door neighbor is intense or apathetic, suggesting that if someone who moves in next door to you is, super aligned with some characteristics of the party that you don't like, that's what's causing you to move away. And I think I just briefly, Emily, read through the thing you posted on Dropbox. So I think when we talk about whether people are moving into a neighborhood for this same sort of reason versus moving out, this could be, I think, something relevant to keep in mind, is that you can look up if people are Republicans or Democrats in North Carolina, but you can't necessarily know how intense those feelings are. But we'll talk about that more, I'm sure, when we get to the discussion. We also conduct a few other heterogeneity and robustness tests. They're all in the paper, but for brevity here are the ones that I think are most important. We document that the effect sizes tend to be increasing. If we split the sample up into sub time periods, we find that effect sizes are increasing. This is consistent with a world where political polarization is having a stronger effect and becoming more salient in recent years. There are also other interpretations and modeling assumptions that we still have to figure out about whether or not it's just increases in political polarization causing these to increase. But this is one thing we're thinking about. And then in another new test, we define population density of different census blocks by dividing the number of people who live in the census block by the acreage. And what we find is that in the top quartile of density, very dense neighborhoods, getting a new next door neighbor of the opposite political party, more likely to move and less likely to refinance. But that effect doesn't hold in the bottom quartile of blocks. And in fact, there's no relationship there. So the story we have in our minds when interpreting that result is that if your new next door neighbors of the opposite political party and you don't really like them very much, it doesn't matter if they live a quarter mile away because you don't necessarily have to interact with them. The last result for today looks at where these households move. In North Carolina, and the voter data, the registration is tied to the county. So if you move within county, you keep the same registration ID information, and we can see people move around within the county. If they leave the county, they're gone from, we can't follow them unless we make some very brave assumptions about people having the same name being the same person. But for this, we're just looking at those within county moves, and that's about 10% of all sales. We see someone sell a house and then show up in that same county in the next quarter in a different house. So what we do is we divide census blocks, sort of initial census blocks, into 5 quintiles of Democrat share, and then look at where those within county sellers move to. There are 2 trends that are important. The first, I think, is as expected. Regardless of political party, people moving out of Democratic blocks are more likely to move into Democratic blocks, and people moving out of Republican blocks are more likely to move into Republican blocks. What we think is most interesting is this difference in the bars. So that is Democrats leaving Republican areas end up in blocks that are more Democratic than blocks where Republicans who are leaving the same initial districts end up at. And that gap is true all along the distribution of initial Democratic block share. And then in the paper, you can see the same table for Republicans, and it's sort of inverted as expected. All right, I'll wrap up. The paper makes 2 important contributions. The first is that we provide evidence, the first evidence that I know of, that households are sorting into increasingly partisan silos and that these silos are really small. We already knew there was an urban and rural silo, and what we're finding is these partisan silos occur at very, very local neighborhood levels. And then the second contribution is evidence that political polarization does have real economic effects. And this is maybe the biggest, big picture takeaway. So the world, America especially, or at least is especially politically polarized and has been becoming more so over time. What exactly that means outside of bickering in the Senate, I think is still trying to be determined. So what we look at here is whether this political polarization has a real economic effect on households. One of households' biggest decisions that they make is whether or not to move, whether or not to refinance. And we find that both of those decisions are driven by the politics of their neighbors and their neighborhoods, consistent with the political polarization story. There are a number of implications for real estate markets and public good allocation. I think, a lot of these implications are somewhat intuitive. What I think is potentially even more concerning as someone who does a lot of works with politics and public policy is that gerrymandering becomes easier and easier the more clustered people are by political affiliation. And with the census being conducted right now and new districts being drawn up in a few years, I'm worried that this sort of hyperlocal sorting could make political influence inequality and wealth inequality problems more severe. Not only because of gerrymandering, but also because public good allocation is going to be feeding back and forth into these things. So it's these sorts of questions that I think are an important area for future work. Since we now have pinned down some evidence that political polarization is having a real effect on migration and political segregation. So that's what I've got for today. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to this